Missing 4 years, 2 girls saved after a rancher's horse refused to leave a hidden canyon. Jake Murphy yanked the reins hard, but his horse wouldn't budge. The stallion planted his hooves in the red dirt and refused to move away from the canyon edge. Something was wrong. Dead wrong. The animal's ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring as he stared down into the hidden ravine that most folks didn't even know existed on the northern edge of Murphy's ranch. It was supposed to be a routine fence check on this scorching Tuesday afternoon in late July. Jake had ridden this territory 1,000 times in the last 15 years since taking over his father's cattle operation. The barbed wire needed constant maintenance, and the summer heat made the metal expand and contract, loosening the posts. But Thunder had never acted like this before. The horse whinnied and stepped closer to the rim, ignoring every command Jake gave him. His massive body trembled with urgency, and foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. Jake dismounted and walked to where Thunder stood. The canyon dropped away sharply, hidden by an overhang of rock and twisted juniper trees that had grown horizontal from the cliff face. Most people would ride right past without knowing it was there. The opening was maybe 10 feet wide, concealed by the natural curve of the land. Jake had done it himself plenty of times over the years, never suspecting the deep chasm that lay just beyond the visible edge. But today, Thunder saw something down there, or heard something, or sensed something with whatever mysterious instinct horses possessed that humans lacked. Then Jake heard it too. A voice. Faint and weak, but unmistakably human. Not the cry of a coyote or the screech of a hawk. Human. His heart hammered in his chest as he dropped to his knees and crawled to the edge, bits of gravel digging into his palms. The canyon was maybe 40 feet deep, its bottom thick with brush and scattered boulders that had tumbled down over countless years. In the shadows cast by the afternoon sun, he saw movement. 2 figures huddled against the far wall, beneath a small overhang that provided minimal shelter from the elements. They were children, girls, and they were alive. Jake's mind raced through a dozen scenarios in seconds. Lost hikers. Runaways? Injured campers? But something about the way they sat so still, so resigned, told him this was worse than any of those possibilities. There was no easy way down. The walls were nearly vertical, smooth rock worn by ancient water flow. The bottom was a maze of thorny scrub brush and prickly pear cactus. He pulled out his phone but had no signal this far out. The cell tower was on the other side of the ridge, and the canyon walls blocked any reception. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. His ranch house was 7 miles back the way he'd come. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted down into the canyon. One of the girls looked up slowly, as if the simple act of raising her head required enormous effort. Her face was dirt-streaked and gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin burned dark by the sun. Her eyes were hollow but alert, watching him with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "Here, baby!" Or disbelief. She didn't call back. She just stared at him like she couldn't believe what she was seeing, like he might be a mirage that would vanish if she blinked. Jake ran back to Thunder and grabbed his lariat from the saddle. The rope was 60 feet of braided nylon, strong enough to hold a full-grown steer. It wasn't long enough to reach the bottom, but he could get partway down and assess the situation better. He needed to know if these children could move on their own or if they were injured. He tied one end to a solid juniper trunk, wrapping it 3 times around and securing it with a bowline knot his father had taught him when he was 8 years old. He tested it with his full weight, bouncing and pulling. It held firm. Before descending, he called down again, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. This time, the girl raised her hand in a weak wave. The gesture was so small, so fragile, that Jake felt his throat tighten. The other girl, smaller and thinner, didn't move at all. She sat with her back against the rock, head tilted to one side, eyes closed. Jake lowered himself over the edge, boots finding purchase on the rough stone. The rock scraped his hands raw despite his leather gloves as he descended hand over hand. The temperature dropped noticeably as he moved into the shadow of the canyon. Halfway down, the rope ended, swaying gently in the still air. He hung there for a moment, measuring the distance with his eyes. It was a 15-foot drop to the canyon floor, maybe a bit more. Manageable for a man in good shape, but he'd have no easy way back up without help. His truck had a winch, but it was 7 miles away. He looked down at the girls again. The older one watched him intently. The younger one still hadn't moved. Jake made his decision. He let go. The landing knocked the wind from his lungs and sent a jolt of pain through his knees and ankles. Thorn bushes tore at his jeans as he scrambled to his feet, leaving long scratches on the denim. The girls were 20 yards away, pressed against the canyon wall in a small alcove that looked like it had been carved by water erosion over thousands of years. As Jake pushed through the brush toward them, stepping carefully to avoid the worst of the thorns, he got his first clear look at what he'd found. The older girl appeared to be around 12 or 13 years old, though malnutrition made it hard to judge. The younger one was maybe 9, possibly younger. Both wore filthy, torn clothing that had once been bright colors but were now faded to dull browns and grays. Their hair was matted and long, hanging past their shoulders in tangled knots. Their arms and legs were covered in scratches, scars, insect bites, and what looked like old bruises in various stages of healing. Jake reached them. The older girl pulled the younger one close and shrank back against the rock wall. Her eyes were wild with fear and suspicion, the look of an animal that had been trapped and hurt too many times to trust easily. Her thin arms wrapped protectively around her sister, and Jake could see every bone in her hands. Jake raised his hands slowly, palms out, making himself as non-threatening as possible. He kept his voice soft and steady, the same tone he used with spooked horses. He told them his name was Jake Murphy. He told them he owned the ranch above. He told them he was here to help. He told them they were safe now, that nobody was going to hurt them anymore. The older girl's lips trembled. She tried to speak but couldn't form words at first. Her breath came in short gasps. Tears streaked through the dirt on her cheeks, leaving clean trails down to her jaw. Jake pulled his water bottle from his belt, moving slowly so as not to startle them. He unscrewed the cap and held it out. The older girl hesitated for a long moment, then snatched it from his hand and immediately pressed it to the younger girl's lips. The little one drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down her chin and soaking into her tattered shirt. When the younger girl had drunk her fill, the older one drank. She tilted her head back and consumed half the remaining water in seconds. When she lowered the bottle, her hand shaking, she finally spoke. Her voice was a rasp, barely audible, like she hadn't used it in months. She told Jake her name was Lily. The younger girl was her sister Emma. Then she said the words that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. They had been down in this canyon for 4 years. Jake felt the words hit him like a physical blow. His vision swam for a second, and he had to steady himself against the canyon wall. 4 years. These children had survived in this hidden canyon for 4 years, less than 2 miles from where he slept every night. Lily's next words came in a flood, like a dam had broken inside her. The story poured out in fragments, disjointed and raw. She told him about the man who had taken them from a shopping center parking lot in Portland when they'd wandered away from their mother for just a minute. How he had drugged them and driven them across state lines. How he had kept them in a shed somewhere in the desert, a place with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. How he had barely fed them. How he had hurt them in ways Lily couldn't fully articulate. How one night, almost 4 years ago, he had left the padlock open by mistake. How they had run in the darkness, barefoot and terrified, with no idea where they were going. How they had stumbled through the desert until dawn, expecting him to catch them at any moment. How they had found this canyon just as the sun came up and had climbed down, seeking shelter and water. How they had discovered they couldn't climb back out. How the walls were too steep and the rock too smooth. How they had survived on rainwater collected in depressions in the rock, on cactus fruit when they could reach it, on the occasional lizard or mouse they managed to catch with traps made from sticks and their shoelaces. How they had seen helicopters fly overhead in those first few weeks. How they had screamed and waved until their voices gave out, but the aircraft never stopped. How they had watched the search parties eventually stop coming. How they had realized the world had forgotten about them. Jake listened, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. His fists were balled at his sides, knuckles white. Above them, thunder whinnied, the sound echoing off the canyon walls, like a ghost. The horse was still up there, still waiting, still watching over the spot where his rider had disappeared. Jake knew he had to move fast. Emma looked dangerously weak, her breathing shallow and her skin pale beneath the sunburn and dirt. Both girls needed medical attention immediately. Dehydration, malnutrition, exposure, infections from their countless wounds. They needed doctors and hospitals and care that Jake couldn't provide down here in this hole. But getting them out of this canyon was going to be a problem. The rope wouldn't support all 3 of them at once, and even if it did, neither girl looked strong enough to climb. Emma seemed barely conscious, slumped against her sister. Lily was alert but skeletal, her arms like twigs. He told Lily as gently as he could that he needed to ride back to the ranch for help. He would bring equipment, maybe his neighbors, definitely call for emergency services. He'd be back within 2 hours, 3 at most. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. Her eyes went wide with panic, pupils dilating. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his skin through his shirt. She begged him not to leave them, not to go. Not again. She said people had promised before. People had said they'd come back, The helicopters had promised with their loudspeakers that they were searching, that help was coming, but nobody ever came back. Nobody ever found them. Jake realized then what 4 years in this canyon had done to these girls beyond the physical damage. They had seen hope dangled in front of them and snatched away over and over. They had screamed until their throats bled, and nobody had heard. They had been forgotten by a world that had moved on, that eventually assumed they were dead, that had stopped looking. The psychological scars ran deeper than anything visible on their skin. He made a decision right there. He looked Lily straight in the eyes and made a promise. He swore on his life, on his father's grave, on everything he held sacred, that he would not leave them alone in this canyon. He would get them out today, right now, this very afternoon. No matter what it took, no matter the risk. He would not add himself to the list of people who abandoned them. Thunder whinnied again from above, more insistent this time. Jake looked up at the narrow slice of blue sky visible between the canyon walls. The sun was already past its peak, beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. He had maybe 4 hours of daylight left, possibly 5 if he was lucky. He helped both girls to their feet, supporting Emma when her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. She weighed almost nothing, maybe 60 pounds at most, light enough that Jake could carry her easily if needed. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he felt how fevered her skin was even through her shirt. But that still left the fundamental problem of getting up a 40-foot vertical wall with 2 children who had been slowly starving for 4 years and who lacked the strength to climb. Jake studied the canyon walls carefully, walking the perimeter while Lily followed close behind, refusing to let him out of her sight. There had to be another way out. Canyons like this were formed by water erosion. Water had to flow somewhere when the flash floods came during monsoon season. There had to be a drainage point, a lower exit where the runoff escaped. He asked Lily if they had explored the full length of the canyon. She nodded, her expression bleak, and pointed west. About 100 yards in that direction, the canyon narrowed progressively until it became a crack maybe 8 inches wide, far too small for even a child to squeeze through. They had tried. Lily showed Jake the scars on her shoulders and hips from attempting to force herself through the gap. The other direction, she said, ended in a sheer rock face about 60 feet high with a deep pool of stagnant water at its base. The pool was their primary water source, collected from seepage and the occasional rain, but the walls there were even smoother and steeper than here. They had no options. No hidden exit. No secret passage. This was a trap. Pure and simple, and these girls had been caught in it for 4 years. Jake made a decision. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but staying down here wasn't an option. Emma needed medical care within hours, not days. He would boost Lily up to the rope. She would climb to the top, and once there, she would tie the rope to Thunder's saddle using the quick-release knot Jake would teach her. The horse was trained for ranch work, accustomed to pulling weight. Thunder could then pull Emma up in a harness Jake would fashion from his belt, jacket, and the bandana he kept in his pocket. After Emma was safe, Jake would climb up himself using whatever strength he had left. It was risky. If the rope broke, someone could be seriously injured or killed in the fall. If Thunder spooked and bolted, Emma could be dragged or dropped. If Lily lacked the strength to make the climb, she could fall and break bones they had no way to set. But the alternative was worse. Staying in the canyon overnight would almost certainly mean Emma's death. The girl was running a fever, clearly fighting some kind of infection. Without antibiotics and IV fluids, soon she might not survive another day. Jake explained the plan to Lily in simple terms, making sure she understood each step. The girl's face showed doubt, fear, and exhaustion. But she nodded. She would do whatever it took to save her sister. That determination, Jake thought, was probably what had kept them alive this long. They made their way back through the brush to the spot directly below the rope, Emma supported between them. Jake positioned himself against the wall and hoisted Lily onto his shoulders. She was so light it barely took any effort. She grabbed the rope with both hands, her grip fierce despite her weakened state. Jake told her to go slow, to rest whenever she needed, to focus on one hand placement at a time. Don't look down. Don't think about the distance. Just climb. Lily started upward. Her movements were shaky and slow, her thin arms trembling with effort. Every few feet, she would pause, wrapping the rope around one arm to take the weight off her hands for a moment. Her breath came in labored gasps that Jake could hear even from below. Her bare feet, toughened by years without shoes, found tiny holds in the rock face. Jake watched her progress, barely breathing himself. He prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to since his father's funeral, prayed the juniper trunk would hold, prayed the rope wouldn't fray against the sharp edge of the rim, prayed Thunder wouldn't panic at the strange situation and bolt, leaving them all stranded. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Lily was halfway up now, 20 feet above the canyon floor. That if she fell from this height, the injuries could be catastrophic. But she kept climbing, kept pulling herself upward with determination that seemed impossible for someone in her condition. At 30 feet, she paused longer, her whole body shaking. Jake called up encouragement, keeping his voice calm and steady even though his own heart was hammering. Just 10 more feet, less than 2 body lengths. She could do this. Lily reached the top and disappeared over the edge. For a terrifying moment, Jake couldn't see her and didn't know if she'd made it safely. Then her face appeared, peering down at him. Even from 40 feet away, Jake could see the tears streaming down her face. She'd made it. She was out. Jake waited, his heart pounding, Emma leaning heavily against him. The girl's eyes were closed, her breathing rapid and shallow. Fever radiated off her small body. Several minutes passed. Jake was about to call up when the rope suddenly jerked and began to lower back into the canyon. Lily had untied it from the tree and was sending it back down. She must have secured it to Thunder's saddle as instructed. The knotwork looked solid even from a distance. Jake worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He stripped off his denim jacket and threaded his leather belt through both sleeves, creating a crude but functional harness. He added his bandana, tying the corners to create additional support points. He secured Emma in the makeshift harness, making sure the loops were tight enough to hold her weight, but not so tight they would cut off circulation. The girl didn't protest. She seemed beyond caring what happened to her, lost in fever dreams. Jake positioned Emma so she was sitting in the harness like a swing. He called up to Lily, his voice carrying clearly in the still canyon air. He told her to take Thunder's reins and walk backwards slowly. Very, very slowly. So slowly it would feel like she wasn't moving at all. The most important thing was steady, constant pressure. No jerking. No sudden movements. The rope went taut. Emma lifted off the ground, rising inch by inch. Jake kept both hands on her, guiding her away from the rock face as she ascended, making sure she didn't scrape against the jagged stone or get caught on any protrusions. She spun slowly in the harness, her head lolling against her chest, completely unaware of the 40-foot drop beneath her. 10 feet up, 20 feet. The makeshift harness held, the belt creaking but not breaking. Emma's arms dangled at her sides. Her small frame looked so fragile, suspended against the massive canyon wall. Halfway up, about 25 feet off the ground, the rope suddenly stopped moving. Emma hung motionless, swaying slightly. Jake's blood ran cold. His breath caught in his throat. He shouted up for Lily. Her voice came back thin and frightened, on the edge of panic. Thunder wouldn't move. The horse was fighting her, tossing his head and backing in the wrong direction. The animal must have felt the unusual weight and resistance and was reacting to the strangeness of it. Jake forced himself to stay calm. He called up instructions, keeping his voice level and authoritative. He told Lily exactly what to do. Check that the rope was properly looped around the saddle horn, make sure it wasn't caught on anything. Then move to Thunder's head. Put her hand on his muzzle. Talk to him in the same soft voice she had heard Jake use earlier. Tell the horse he was good. Tell him everything was all right. Thunder knew that voice. He'd respond to calm confidence. For several long moments that felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Emma hung motionless against the canyon wall, suspended in space. Jake stood beneath her, helpless, watching her small form sway gently. If the harness failed now, if the rope slipped, if Thunder bolted, she would fall. Then, slowly, the rope began to move again. Inch by agonizing inch, Emma rose toward the top. Lily must have gotten through to the horse. Thunder was moving backward again, pulling steadily. Jake felt weak with relief, but didn't allow himself to celebrate yet. Still 15 feet to go. 10 feet. 5. Emma's head rose above the rim of the canyon. Her legs, then her torso, then she was up and over. Safe. Jake released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were shaking. He bent over, hands on his knees, and took several deep breaths to steady himself. One down, one to go. He grabbed the rope, which Lily had secured, and dropped back down for him. The fiber was rough against his already raw palms. He wrapped it around his right hand once for extra grip and started climbing. His arms burned with fatigue almost immediately. He wasn't a young man anymore. 43 years of ranch work had kept him strong, but not as resilient as he'd been at 20. The rough fiber tore at his raw palms, and he could feel blood making his grip slippery. But he forced himself upward, hand over hand, boots scraping against the rock face, searching for any small ledge or crack. 15 feet up, his shoulders were screaming. 20 feet up, his forearms felt like they were on fire. Every pull was agony. Near the top, maybe 5 feet from the rim, his grip slipped. His left hand lost its hold on the rope completely. For one terrible second, he swung sideways, suspended by only his right hand. He slammed into the canyon wall with his shoulder, and pain exploded through his upper body like lightning. Stars burst across his vision, but he held on. His right hand, wrapped in the rope, bore his full weight. Somehow, it didn't let go. A desperate burst of effort fueled by pure adrenaline, he got his left hand back on the rope. 3 more pulls. 2. 1. His head cleared the rim. He could see grass and sky. With the last of his strength, he hauled himself over the edge and collapsed on solid ground. He lay on his back, chest heaving, staring up at the endless blue sky. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think, just breathed. Thunder stood a few feet away, still attached to the rope. Emma lay on the ground beside the horse, still secured in the makeshift harness. Lily knelt next to her sister, holding her hand and crying, her whole body shaking with sobs of relief and exhaustion. Jake forced himself to sit up despite the pain in his shoulder. He untangled Emma from the harness with fumbling fingers. The girl's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glazed. He lifted her in his arms. She weighed no more than a bag of grain, maybe less. Every rib was visible through her shirt. He could feel the sharp points of her shoulder blades. He placed her as gently as he could across Thunder's saddle, positioning her so she wouldn't slide off. Then he climbed up behind her, his battered shoulder protesting every movement. He held Emma steady with one arm, keeping her balanced. Lily stood nearby, uncertain. Jake reached down with his free hand and pulled her up. She settled in front of him and he clicked his tongue. Thunder started walking toward the ranch house at a steady, measured pace. The horse seemed to understand the fragility of his cargo, moving more carefully than usual. As they rode, Jake pulled out his satellite emergency beacon from his saddlebag. The device was expensive, something he'd bought after getting lost in a sudden blizzard 3 years ago and nearly freezing to death before finding his way home. He activated it with shaking fingers, sending out the automated distress signal with GPS coordinates. The signal would reach emergency services within minutes, alerting them that someone at his location needed immediate help. The ride back took over an hour, though Jake urged Thunder to move as fast as safely possible. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. Lily sat rigid and silent, her eyes scanning the horizon constantly, as if she still couldn't believe they were really out, really free. When the ranch house came into view, Jake saw flashing lights already there. 3 sheriff's vehicles, 2 ambulances, and what looked like a fire rescue truck. The satellite beacon had worked. Help had arrived faster than he'd dared hope. Paramedics rushed forward the moment Thunder stopped. They took Emma from Jake's arms with professional efficiency, laying her on a stretcher and immediately starting an assessment. One medic called out numbers and observations. Severe dehydration, fever of 103, multiple infected wounds, possible sepsis. They started an IV in her arm, the needle looking huge against her thin skin. Lily climbed down from the horse, but refused to leave her sister's side. When a second paramedic tried to examine her, she pulled away, her eyes wild. The only thing that calmed her was when they brought both stretchers close together so the sisters could hold hands while being treated. Jake dismounted on shaking legs and nearly fell. A deputy caught his arm, steadying him. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man Jake had known for 20 years, approached with his notebook out. He started asking questions in his official capacity, but his voice was gentle. Jake gave him the basic facts. Found them in Hidden Canyon. 2 girls. They'd been there for 4 years, abducted from Portland. There was a man who'd taken them, kept them somewhere, but they'd escaped. Lily could tell them more when she was able. Bradley's face went pale as Jake talked. He radioed for FBI assistance, something about a cold case and a missing persons investigation. Within 20 minutes, federal agents were being dispatched. Jake watched the paramedics work, watched them stabilize both girls enough for transport. Emma was in worse shape, they said. Kidney infection, severe malnutrition, dehydration, infected wounds on her feet and legs. But she would probably survive if they got her to the hospital quickly. Lily was in better condition, relatively speaking, but still critically malnourished and dehydrated. Both would need extended hospital stays. The ambulances prepared to leave. Lily's eyes found Jake's as they loaded her stretcher. Even across the distance, even with paramedics surrounding her, she mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Then the doors closed and the ambulances pulled away, lights flashing, sirens wailing as they raced toward the regional medical center 40 miles away. Sheriff Bradley touched Jake's arm. He said Jake should get cleaned up and get his shoulder looked at. They would need a full statement, but it could wait a few hours. The important thing was the girls were safe now. The officer's face was grim. He mentioned the FBI was already pulling files on missing children from the Portland area 4 years ago. Agents would want to visit the canyon, document everything, collect evidence. This was now a major criminal investigation. Jake nodded numbly and led Thunder to the barn. His hands trembled as he removed the saddle and bridle. He brushed the horse down, moving on autopilot, his mind still processing everything that had happened. Thunder had known. Somehow, the horse had known those girls were down there. Had refused to leave that spot until Jake investigated. If Thunder had been any other horse, less stubborn, more obedient, Jake would have pulled him away and ridden on. The girls would have died in that canyon within days. Emma wouldn't have survived another week in her condition. Jake finished with Thunder and made sure the horse had fresh water and extra grain. The animal had earned it. Had earned far more than Jake could ever repay. When Jake finally made it to the house, he found he couldn't eat despite not having food since breakfast. His shoulder throbbed with deep, radiating pain. His palms were torn up, bloody and raw, but none of that mattered. 2 children who had been missing for 4 years had been found. Had been saved. Were alive. That night, Jake didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's fevered face, Lily's desperate grip on his arm, the dark depths of that canyon. He kept thinking about the timing. If he had ridden out an hour earlier or later, would Thunder have stopped? If he had chosen a different route for his fence check, if he had decided to skip that section for another day, what would have happened? The girls might never have been found. The next morning, Jake's body ached like he'd been trampled. His shoulder was swollen and purple, probably a partial separation, but he was too stubborn to go to the hospital for himself when those girls were fighting for their lives. The FBI arrived at dawn. 2 agents in dark suits that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty ranch yard. Agent Holland was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes. Agent Chen was younger, Asian American, with a sharp gaze that took in every detail. They wanted to see the canyon. Needed to document the scene, collect evidence, understand how the girls had survived for so long. Jake saddled Thunder again, his shoulder screaming in protest, and led the agents out to the site. The ride took 40 minutes. Neither agent spoke much, both reviewing files on tablets they'd brought. When they reached the canyon, Jake dismounted and walked them to the edge. From up here, you really couldn't see anything below. The overhang completely concealed the canyon floor. Agent Holland shook his head in disbelief. He pulled out his phone and showed Jake something. Search maps from 4 years ago. This entire area had been searched extensively after Lily and Emma disappeared. Helicopters with thermal imaging had flown over multiple times. Ground search parties had walked grids across every square mile. Search dogs had covered the region. But the canyon had been invisible to all of them. The thermal imaging couldn't penetrate the rock overhang. The search dogs had found no scent trail because the girls had been carried most of the way in a vehicle. The ground teams had walked within yards of this spot without knowing the hidden canyon existed. It was a perfect trap. Natural camouflage that had kept 2 children hidden in plain sight for 4 years. Agent Chen asked Jake about Thunder's behavior. What exactly had the horse done? Why had he stopped at that particular spot? What had made him refuse to move? Jake explained as best he could. The horse had just planted himself, had refused all commands to move on, had stared down into the canyon and whinnied. Horses had instincts humans didn't understand. Maybe Thunder had heard something Jake's ears had missed. Maybe he'd caught a scent on the wind. Or maybe some things just happened for reasons beyond logical explanation. The agents descended into the canyon using professional climbing gear and ropes they'd brought. They were down there for over an hour. When they emerged, both looked shaken. Their professional composure had cracked. Agent Holland's hands trembled as he packed away his camera. He described what they'd found. A small shelter built from branches and pieces of torn clothing, barely large enough for 2 children to huddle under. A collection of containers made from pieces of trash that had blown into the canyon, arranged in a precise pattern to catch rainwater from the rare storms. The remains of dozens of small fires, carefully built in spots where the smoke would drift up and out of the canyon. Evidence that the girls had tried repeatedly over the years to climb the walls, the rocks scarred with scratch marks at various heights where they had fallen back, some of the marks 15 or 20 feet up where Lily must have gotten before losing her grip. Most heartbreaking were the messages. Agent Chen's voice cracked as she described them. Names scratched into the soft sandstone of the canyon wall. Dates marked by tiny lines grouped in weeks and months. Messages to their parents, declarations of love and desperate pleas for rescue. The earliest dates back 4 years and 2 months to August when they'd first arrived. The messages became less frequent over time, as if hope had slowly died. The last message was dated just 3 weeks ago. A simple sentence. Still here. Still alive. Please find us. Jake felt sick. These children had been so close to his daily routes. While he'd been moving cattle, fixing fences, living his normal life, Lily and Emma had been fighting for survival in a hole in the ground less than 2 miles from his bedroom window. He'd probably ridden past this spot dozens of times over the past 4 years, completely unaware. The FBI launched a full investigation immediately. They pulled the cold case files on Lily and Emma Morris, aged 9 and 6 when they were abducted from a shopping center in Portland, Oregon. Their mother had been loading groceries. The girls had asked to return a cart. She'd said yes, had watched them walk away, had looked down to arrange bags in her trunk. When she'd looked up 30 seconds later, they were gone. The initial investigation had been massive. Hundreds of volunteers, professional search teams, national media coverage, but there'd been no leads, no witnesses who'd seen anything useful. Security camera footage showed a partial view of a white van in the parking lot, but no license plate, no clear view of the driver. The trail had gone completely cold within weeks. After 6 months, the official search had been scaled back. After a year, it had basically ended. The girls had been presumed dead by most people, though their parents had never given up hope. Now, 4 years later, they'd been found alive through sheer chance and the stubbornness of a horse. Within 48 hours, the FBI had tracked down their abductor. His name was Vincent Carter, a 53-year-old drifter with a record of minor offenses, but nothing that had flagged him as dangerous. He'd been living in a remote cabin near the Arizona border, supporting himself with odd jobs and disability checks. When agents raided his property based on Lily's description of the location where they'd been held, they found everything. The shed where he'd kept the girls, chains bolted to the floor, evidence of other children over the years. Hard drives full of material that made seasoned agents physically ill. Carter was arrested without incident. He'd assumed the girls were long dead, had never expected them to be found. He confessed to everything within hours of interrogation, maybe seeking some twisted form of redemption, or maybe just tired of running. The full extent of his crimes would take months to uncover, but initial evidence linked him to at least 3 other missing children cases spanning a decade. Jake learned most of this from Sheriff Bradley, who stopped by the ranch every few days with updates. The media had descended like locusts within 24 hours of the girls being found. News vans lined the road to Jake's property. Reporters shouted questions whenever he tried to leave. Helicopters flew overhead, getting aerial footage of the ranch and the canyon. Jake refused all interview requests. He had no interest in becoming part of the circus. The only statement he gave was through Sheriff Bradley, saying he was grateful his horse had led him to the girls and that his thoughts were with their family. He didn't mention the nightmares that now plagued him every night, or the guilt that gnawed at him constantly, even though he knew rationally it wasn't his fault. The girls' parents arrived from Oregon 2 days after the rescue. Jake met them at the county hospital where Lily and Emma were being treated. He didn't want to intrude, but Sheriff Bradley had arranged the meeting at their request. Patricia Morris collapsed in tears the moment she saw Jake. She couldn't speak for several minutes, just sobbed while her husband Gordon held her and gripped Jake's hand with crushing force. When she finally managed to talk, Patricia told Jake about the 4 years of hell they'd endured. The constant not knowing that was worse than any certainty. The investigation that had eventually gone cold despite their pleading. The way people had slowly stopped talking about their daughters. The looks of pity that had replaced looks of hope after the first year. The suggestion from well-meaning friends that they needed to move on and accept what happened. They never stopped searching. Never stopped believing their girls were alive somewhere. But they had begun to accept they might never know what happened. That they might spend the rest of their lives wondering. Now their daughters were back. Alive. Traumatized and malnourished, but alive and recovering. Jake asked about the girl's condition. Patricia wiped her eyes and explained through tears that, physically, both were in critical but stable condition. Emma had a severe kidney infection that required aggressive antibiotic treatment and IV fluids. She'd been dangerously close to organ failure when she arrived. The doctors said another few days without treatment and she probably wouldn't have survived. Lily had several old fractures that had healed incorrectly over the years, a broken collarbone and 2 broken fingers. Both girls had parasitic infections from contaminated water and food. Both showed signs of long-term malnutrition, including stunted growth and developmental delays. Emma was the height and weight of a 6-year-old, despite being 9. Lily looked 10 instead of 13, but the doctors were cautiously optimistic. With time, proper nutrition, and medical care, their bodies would recover most of the damage. They were young, resilient. The human body could heal from remarkable trauma given the right support. The psychological damage was harder to assess and would take much longer to address. Both girls suffered from severe PTSD. They were terrified of enclosed spaces and panicked when left alone for even minutes. They refused to be separated from each other for any reason, becoming violent and hysterical when doctors tried to examine them in separate rooms. Hospital staff had given up and moved them to a shared room with beds pushed together. Lily had nightmares every time she fell asleep, waking screaming about being trapped, about the man coming back, about her sister dying. Emma hadn't spoken a word since being rescued, except to whisper her sister's name occasionally. Child psychologists were working with them, but recovery would take years if it happened at all. Some wounds went too deep to ever fully heal. But they were alive, they were safe, and they were going home, eventually. Gordon asked if he could see the place where Jake had found them. Patricia chose to stay at the hospital with the girls, but Gordon needed to see it with his own eyes. Jake understood that need, that desperate desire to understand what his children had endured. They drove out to the canyon the next day. Jake borrowed a neighbor's truck since media still surrounded his property. The ride was quiet. Gordon stared out the window at the passing landscape, this harsh desert country where his daughters had suffered for so long. When they reached the canyon, Jake led Gordon to the edge. The man stood there for a long time, just staring down into the depths. Then he fell to his knees and broke down completely. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal. Jake stood a respectful distance away, giving the man space to grieve. When Gordon finally composed himself enough to speak, he asked Jake to tell him everything, every detail of the rescue. So Jake did. He described Thunder's strange behavior, that moment when he first heard Lily's voice, the climb down, the condition he'd found the girls in, their frail bodies and hollow eyes, the difficult extraction, Lily's courage climbing the rope despite her weakened state, the terror when Thunder had stopped pulling Emma up. When Jake finished, Gordon was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question Jake had been expecting, the question that had no good answer. Why hadn't the search teams found them? His daughters had been here, right here, less than 2 miles from inhabited ranch land. They'd been screaming for help while helicopters flew overhead. How was that possible? How could hundreds of trained professionals with millions of dollars of equipment miss 2 children for 4 years? Jake explained what the FBI agents had told him about the canyon's concealment, about the limitations of thermal imaging through rock, about how the natural geography had created a perfect hiding spot. But Gordon wasn't looking for technical explanations. He was looking for someone to blame, something to make sense of the senseless. Jake had no answers that would satisfy a father's grief and rage. Sometimes the world was cruel in ways that defied understanding. Sometimes bad luck compounded until tragedy seemed inevitable. Sometimes good people trying their best simply failed despite all their efforts. Jake had learned that lesson when his own father had died in a ranch accident, crushed by a rolling tractor that had come loose from its blocks. A dozen small decisions made differently that day would have prevented it. But those decisions had been made, and consequences had followed, and placing blame didn't bring anyone back or undo anything. They stood together in silence for nearly 30 minutes. Jake pointed out the juniper tree he'd tied the rope to, still showing marks from the friction. Showed Gordon the approximate spot where he'd found the girls huddled. The man absorbed every detail like he was trying to memorize it, trying to understand every moment his daughters had lived through. On the walk back to the truck, Gordon asked about Thunder. Jake told him the horse was a 6-year-old Mustang he'd gentled from the wild herd that roamed the federal lands bordering his property. Smart as any horse Jake had ever worked with, and stubborn as hell when he made up his mind about something. Most ranchers wanted obedient horses that followed commands without question. Jake had always preferred horses with personality, even if that sometimes meant dealing with a stubborn streak. Today he was grateful beyond words for Thunder's refusal to obey. Gordon asked if he could meet Thunder. Back at the ranch, navigating through the media circus that still hadn't dissipated, Jake led the horse out of the barn. Thunder approached Gordon calmly and let the man stroke his neck. Gordon pressed his face against the horse's mane and whispered something Jake couldn't hear. When he pulled away, his eyes were wet again. He told Jake that whatever the ranch needed, whatever Thunder needed, Gordon would provide. Money was no object. If Jake needed equipment, supplies, veterinary care, anything at all, he should call. Gordon pressed a business card into Jake's hand and gripped his shoulder. The gesture said more than words could. Jake watched Gordon drive away, his truck disappearing down the dirt road toward the highway. He looked at Thunder, who stood patiently waiting for whatever came next. The horse had no concept of the miracle he'd performed. To Thunder, stopping at that canyon edge had been instinct, nothing more. Something had smelled wrong or sounded wrong or felt wrong to the horse's senses far more acute than human ones in ways scientists still didn't fully understand. But because Thunder had trusted those instincts and had been stubborn enough to refuse his rider's commands, 2 children were alive. Over the following weeks, the media attention gradually faded as new tragedies and new stories captured public interest. The investigation into Vincent Carter expanded to include potential accomplices and additional victims. Evidence suggested he'd been operating for over a decade, moving frequently, always staying just ahead of any investigation. The true number of children he'd taken might never be known. Jake followed the news reports with grim interest but tried to maintain his distance from the circus. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deals, movie offers. He declined all of them. This wasn't his story to profit from. It belonged to Lily and Emma, and they deserved privacy to heal without the world watching. The girls remained hospitalized for nearly 3 weeks before doctors cleared them for travel. Patricia Morris called Jake the day before they were scheduled to fly back to Oregon. She thanked him again, her voice breaking, and told him the girls wanted to see him before they left. Jake drove to the hospital that afternoon, navigating past security and reporters camped outside. He found Lily and Emma in a shared room on the pediatric floor, surrounded by stuffed animals and get-well cards from strangers across the country. Both girls looked dramatically different from the skeletal children he'd pulled from the canyon. They'd gained weight, maybe 10 pounds each, and the hollow look had started to fade from their eyes. Color had returned to their cheeks. Their hair had been washed and cut to remove the worst of the matting. They wore clean hospital gowns instead of rags, but the trauma remained visible in other ways. The way they sat close together on one bed, bodies touching, holding hands. The way their eyes tracked every person who entered the room. The way they both tensed when the door opened unexpectedly. Some damages ran deeper than the body. Lily smiled when Jake entered, a real smile that reached her eyes, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. She thanked him for not leaving them in the canyon, for keeping his promise, for bringing them home to their parents, for giving them their lives back. Emma still wasn't speaking to strangers, but she watched Jake with curious eyes. After a moment of apparent internal debate, she slipped off the bed and approached him on bare feet, moving with the caution of a wild animal. She was tiny, barely reaching Jake's waist even at 9 years old, her growth stunted by years of malnutrition. She held out her small hand and Jake took it gently, careful not to squeeze too hard. She looked up at him with solemn brown eyes and squeezed his fingers 3 times, each squeeze deliberate and distinct. Then she returned to her sister's side and climbed back onto the bed. Lily explained that was Emma's way of saying thank you. 3 squeezes. It was a game their father had taught them when they were small, back before everything had changed. 1 squeeze meant I love you. 2 squeezes meant stay safe. 3 squeezes meant thank you. Emma wasn't talking yet, but she was communicating in the way she could. That was progress, the therapist said. That was a sign of healing, however slow. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. He told the girls he was proud of them for surviving, for being strong when the world had been unbearably cruel, for protecting each other when no one else could, for never giving up hope even when they had every reason to. The world was lucky to still have them in it, he said, and he meant every word. Before he left, Lily asked about Thunder. Her eyes lit up when she talked about the horse, one of the few subjects that didn't bring shadows across her face. Jake told her Thunder was doing well, eating extra grain and being thoroughly spoiled. He promised to send her pictures. She made him promise something else too, her voice suddenly serious and intense. Promise that he would never sell Thunder. Promise that he would take care of the horse for the rest of its life. That horse had saved them when nothing and no one else could. That horse deserved to live out his days in peace and comfort. Jake gave his word without hesitation. It was an easy promise to make. Thunder would never be sold, never be traded, never leave the ranch. The horse would live out his years in the best pasture, would receive the best care Jake could provide, would be treated with the respect and gratitude he deserved. The Morris family left for Oregon the next day. Sheriff Bradley drove them to the airport in an unmarked car to avoid media attention. Patricia sent Jake a text when they landed safely, thanking him again. Over the following months, Jake received periodic updates. The girls were in intensive therapy, multiple sessions per week with specialists in childhood trauma. Emma had started speaking again, though, only to immediate family members and only in whispers. Loud noises frightened her. Unexpected movements made her flinch. She had nightmares most nights and would only sleep if Lily was in the same room. Lily was attending school but struggled with crowds and unexpected schedule changes. She'd been placed back in 6th grade despite being 13, had missed so much education during the lost years that she needed to catch up. She was making progress academically, but the social aspects were harder. Other kids didn't know how to talk to her. How do you make small talk with someone who survived 4 years of captivity? Teachers tried to be understanding, but sometimes pushed too hard or not hard enough. Both girls were making progress, the therapist reported. Healing was possible. The human mind was remarkably resilient, especially in children. But recovery would be a lifelong process. Some scars would never completely fade. One afternoon in late autumn, Jake received a package in the mail. The return address was Portland, Oregon. Inside was a drawing from Emma. It showed a man on a horse at the edge of a canyon. The man was rendered in simple lines, a stick figure with a cowboy hat. The horse was more detailed, drawn with obvious care, brown with a black mane. Two smaller stick figures stood in the canyon below, reaching up toward the man. Their faces had huge smiles. Above the picture, in careful child's handwriting that showed the wobbling lines of someone relearning to write, were 3 words, "Our hero Thunder." Jake pinned the drawing to the wall of his kitchen where he could see it every morning while drinking coffee. It joined the photo Patricia had sent of the girls at home, healthy and smiling in matching sweaters. These 2 items reminded him that sometimes the smallest decisions mattered more than anyone could predict. If he'd chosen a different route that day, if he'd ignored Thunder's strange behavior, if he'd convinced himself he was imagining the voice from the canyon, 2 girls would have died, alone and forgotten in that hole. But he hadn't ignored it. Thunder hadn't let him. And now those girls had a chance at life again, at healing, at futures that had nearly been stolen from them. Sheriff Bradley stopped by the ranch a few weeks later, bringing final news about the case. Vincent Carter had confessed to abducting Lily and Emma from that shopping mall in Portland. He'd watched the family for weeks, had known their routines, had waited for the perfect moment. When the girls walked away from their mother to return the shopping cart, he'd grabbed them, had drugged them with chloroform-soaked rags, had thrown them in his van and driven away, all in less than 60 seconds. He'd kept them in a shed on a rented property near the Mexican border, a place so remote the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away. He'd planned to transport them across the border, had contacts who would pay for young American children. But the girls had been difficult, had fought and screamed and refused to cooperate. He'd gotten sloppy, had made mistakes. One night he'd forgotten to check the padlock after one of his rare visits. The girls had discovered it was unlocked and had run. They'd fled into the desert in the middle of the night, barefoot and terrified, with no idea where they were going or if they'd survive. They'd just known they had to get away. They'd wandered for 3 days through brutal desert heat with no food and almost no water. They should have died from exposure. Somehow they'd survived on rainwater from puddles and the occasional cactus fruit. On the 3rd day, delirious and near death, they'd stumbled into the hidden canyon while looking for shade. They'd climbed down seeking shelter and water, had found a seep that provided enough moisture to survive. By the time they'd recovered enough to attempt climbing out, they'd realized they were trapped. The walls were too smooth, too high. They'd tried hundreds of times over the years, had fallen and been injured, had eventually accepted that escape was impossible. So they'd survived. They'd collected rainwater. They'd eaten insects, lizards, the occasional bird's egg when they could reach a nest. They'd learned which plants were safe to eat and which would make them sick. They'd become expert at catching the small animals that lived in the canyon. They'd built shelter from brush and their own torn clothing. They'd kept count of the days by scratching marks on the canyon wall. 4 years. 1,460 days. 35,040 hours. Each one a battle for survival that 2 children should never have had to fight. Carter had searched for them for about a week after they escaped, then had assumed they'd died in the desert. He'd moved his operation to a new location and had continued his crimes. The evidence the FBI collected would put him away for multiple life sentences. 3 other children he'd taken over the years had not been as fortunate as Lily and Emma. Their remains had been found at various locations. Their families finally had closure, though not the kind anyone wanted. Bradley also mentioned that the search and rescue teams who had worked the original case were devastated by the revelation that the girls had been so close all along. Several experienced volunteers had quit in frustration and grief. Others were pushing for new protocols and better technology to prevent similar failures in the future. The hidden canyon was now being used as a training site, teaching searchers what to look for and how natural geography could conceal victims. Jake listened but offered no judgment. Search and rescue did their best with the tools and knowledge they had. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. Blame wouldn't change what had happened. What mattered now was that 2 girls were home with their family. They had futures they'd nearly been denied, and they'd survived 4 years of hell through sheer will and the love between sisters. Most adults couldn't have done what those children had done. Winter came to the ranch. Jake continued his daily routines, moving cattle between pastures, repairing equipment, preparing for the hard months ahead. Thunder remained his primary riding horse, and Jake found himself trusting the animal's instincts more than ever before. When Thunder hesitated or showed reluctance about something, Jake paid attention now. The horse had proven he noticed things humans missed. One cold December morning, Jake rode out to check fence lines in the northern pasture. Thunder stopped suddenly near a dry creek bed, the same behavior he'd shown at the canyon. Ears forward, body tense, refusing to move. He dismounted immediately and walked to where Thunder was focused. In the sandy bottom of the creek bed, barely visible in the early morning light, he found tracks. Mountain lion. Fresh, maybe only a few hours old. And the tracks were heading directly toward the pasture where he currently had 20 head of cattle with newborn calves. A big cat could kill multiple calves in one night, could devastate the herd. Jake called his ranch hands on the radio and organized a response. They spent the day tracking the lion, eventually finding it bedded down in a rocky outcrop. They were able to tranquilize it and safely relocate it to wilderness area 30 miles away where it wouldn't threaten livestock. Later, Jake wondered what would have happened if Thunder hadn't noticed those tracks. How many calves would have been killed before he discovered the lion? How much money would have been lost? How much suffering could have occurred? But Thunder had noticed. Just like he'd noticed something wrong at the hidden canyon months earlier, the horse understood things humans didn't. Jake started thinking of Thunder as more than just livestock. The horse was a partner, a guardian, maybe even a friend who perceived the world in ways Jake never could. Christmas arrived. Jake received a card from Lily and Emma, forwarded through Sheriff Bradley to maintain their privacy from media attention. Inside were individual notes from each girl written in careful handwriting. Lily wrote about school and therapy and learning to trust the world again. She was reading books about survival stories, about other people who had overcome terrible circumstances. It helped, she said, to know they weren't alone in their suffering. She was making friends slowly, though it was hard to relate to other kids her age who worried about normal things like grades and crushes. Emma's note was shorter, just a few sentences in shaky handwriting that showed she was still relearning motor skills affected by malnutrition. She thanked Jake for saving her life. She said she thought about him in Thunder every day. She promised she would never forget them, would never forget the moment she'd looked up from the canyon and seen Jake's face above her, that moment when she'd first believed they might actually survive. Tucked into the card was a photograph. Both girls sitting on a couch in what looked like a comfortable living room. They wore matching Christmas sweaters, one red and one green. They were smiling genuine smiles. They looked healthy, their faces filled out, their eyes bright. They looked like normal kids enjoying the holidays. Happy, safe, alive. Jake placed the photo next to Emma's drawing in his kitchen, creating a small shrine to a miracle. 2 reminders of a day that had changed everything. New Year came and went. The investigation into Vincent Carter concluded with multiple convictions. The man would spend the rest of his life in prison with no possibility of parole. Other victims' families found some measure of closure as remains were identified and returned. The media moved on to new tragedies and new heroes. Life continued its normal rhythm, but Jake's life remained quietly altered in ways both small and large. He found himself more aware of his surroundings when riding, more attentive to details he might have previously ignored, more willing to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. He'd learned that paying attention to small anomalies could mean the difference between life and death. He also found himself thinking often about the fragility of life and the randomness of fate, how quickly everything could change based on tiny decisions and moments of chance. How many people walked through the world unaware of suffering happening just out of sight? How easy it was to miss someone crying for help if you weren't paying attention. Those thoughts made him more patient, more kind, more aware. When a neighbor needed help with a sick animal, Jake drove over immediately instead of putting it off. When he saw kids by the roadside, he always slowed down and made sure they were safe. Small actions mattered. Attention mattered. Thunder aged gracefully through winter and into spring. Jake treated the horse with extra care, making sure he had the best feed and regular visits from the veterinarian. It was the least he could do for an animal that had saved 2 lives. In early spring, Gordon Morris called Jake with an invitation. The family wanted to visit the ranch. They wanted the girls to see where they'd been found, to properly thank Thunder, to maybe find some closure by confronting the place of their trauma in a safe, controlled way. Their therapist thought it might help with the healing process. Jake agreed immediately. They arrived on a bright April morning when the desert was blooming with wildflowers. Lily and Emma looked dramatically different from the children Jake had pulled from the canyon nearly 9 months earlier. They were healthy now, filled out to appropriate weights for their ages. Lily had cut her hair in a short pixie style. Emma wore glasses that made her look studious and serious. Both carried themselves with more confidence, though Jake could still see wariness in their eyes. They were nervous at first, stepping out of their father's truck and looking around at the ranch with obvious anxiety. But when Jake brought Thunder out of the barn, both girls relaxed visibly. They approached the horse slowly, reaching out with tentative hands to stroke his neck and muzzle. Thunder stood perfectly still, patient and gentle as always, seeming to understand these were special visitors who needed careful handling. Emma whispered something to the horse that Jake couldn't hear, her lips moving against Thunder's soft nose. The horse turned his head and nuzzled her shoulder gently, making her giggle. It was a sound of pure joy, untainted by trauma. a sound Jake had wondered if he'd ever hear from this girl. Jake offered to take them to the canyon if they wanted. Patricia and Gordon exchanged uncertain glances. This was why they'd come, but now that the moment was here, they weren't sure it was a good idea. Lily made the decision for them. She said firmly that she needed to see it again, needed to prove to herself it was real and that she had escaped it, needed to look down into that hole and know she would never be trapped there again. They rode out together, a small procession. The girls shared a gentle mare named Daisy while Jake rode Thunder. Gordon and Patricia followed in Jake's truck, unable to ride but wanting to be present. At the canyon's edge, everyone dismounted. The girls approached the rim slowly, still holding hands the way they always did. They looked down into the depths where they'd spent 4 years of their lives, where they'd suffered and survived and nearly died. For a long time, neither girl spoke. They just stood there looking down at the place that had been their prison and their home and their nightmare all at once. Then Lily picked up a small rock. She looked at it for a moment, then threw it as hard as she could into the canyon. Bounced off the walls with sharp cracks, the sound echoing, and disappeared into the brush below. Emma did the same, her throw weaker but her intent clear. They were reclaiming this place, removing its power over them. Then they turned away and didn't look back. On the ride back to the ranch house, Emma spoke for the first time since arriving. Her voice was soft but clear, no longer the whisper her parents had described. She asked Jake if Thunder had really known they were down there, if the horse had somehow sensed them when humans couldn't. Jake considered the question carefully before answering. He told her he believed animals understood things people didn't. They perceived the world differently, noticed details humans missed. Whether Thunder had heard them or smelled them or simply felt that something was wrong, Jake couldn't say for certain. But yes, the horse had known, and that knowledge, combined with Thunder's stubborn refusal to obey commands to move on, had saved their lives. Emma seemed satisfied with that answer. She fell silent again, but Jake noticed she was smiling. Before the family left that afternoon, Gordon pulled Jake aside one more time. He repeated his offer of support for anything Jake or the ranch might need. Then he shared some news. He and Patricia had established a foundation in Lily and Emma's names to support other missing children cases. The foundation would fund search efforts, provide resources to families, advocate for better search technologies and protocols. They wanted Jake and Thunder to be part of the launch event in Portland. Their story could inspire hope in families who had lost children. Could remind people to stay vigilant and trust their instincts. Could maybe save other children the way Lily and Emma had been saved. Jake was reluctant. He had no desire for publicity or recognition. He was just a rancher who had paid attention when his horse acted strangely. But Gordon pressed, appealing to Jake's sense of duty and compassion. Other families were suffering the way they had suffered. Other children were missing right now, trapped somewhere, hoping someone would find them. If sharing this story could help even one of them, wasn't that worth the discomfort of public attention? Jake eventually agreed to one appearance, for the girls' sake, to help other families still searching. The foundation launch happened in Portland 3 months later, a big event at a downtown hotel with hundreds of attendees. Jake flew out, and Thunder was transported in a special trailer by a professional equine transport service that Gordon had hired. The event was attended by hundreds of people, families of missing children, law enforcement officials, search and rescue volunteers, media from across the country, politicians who wanted to be seen supporting a worthy cause. The whole affair made Jake deeply uncomfortable, but he endured it for Lily and Emma. The girls both spoke, their voices strong and certain despite the huge crowd. They talked about their experience in broad terms, about the importance of never giving up hope, about how someone had finally found them because a horse had trusted its instincts. They credited Jake and Thunder with their rescue, but they also talked about their own strength and survival. They'd kept each other alive through love and determination. That was a message worth sharing. Jake gave a brief statement about listening to instincts and paying attention to small details that seemed out of place. He emphasized that he wasn't a hero. He was simply a rancher who had noticed his horse acting strangely and had investigated instead of ignoring it. Anyone could have done the same. The real heroes, he insisted, were Lily and Emma themselves. 2 children who had survived 4 years of captivity and isolation through courage and love and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Thunder stood calmly through the entire event, unbothered by the crowds and cameras and noise. At one point, a young boy whose sister had been missing for 2 years approached nervously and asked to pet the horse. Thunder lowered his head and let the boy stroke his nose. The boy's mother broke down crying at the simple kindness of the gesture. People kept approaching Thunder throughout the event. Missing children's siblings, parents who were still searching, survivors of other traumas who found comfort in the gentle animal. Thunder accepted all the attention with patience and grace. Jake realized then, watching all these people find comfort in touching this horse, why Gordon had insisted on this appearance. It wasn't really about him or even about Thunder. It was about showing people that miracles could happen, that lost children could be found against impossible odds, that hope wasn't foolish even when circumstances seemed absolutely hopeless, that paying attention to small things mattered. After the event, Jake and Thunder returned to the ranch. Life resumed its normal rhythm, seasons changed, cattle were moved between pastures, fences were mended, equipment broken was repaired. The daily work of running a ranch continued without pause. But Jake was different now. He noticed things he hadn't before. He paid attention when Thunder or any of the other horses acted unusually. He trusted his gut when something felt off. And he kept in regular touch with Lily and Emma, who sent updates about their lives several times a year. Lily started high school and joined the track team. Running gave her a sense of control and accomplishment. She was fast, her body having adapted to years of desperate movement in the canyon. Emma became obsessed with horses and begged her parents for riding lessons. Patricia enrolled her in a therapeutic riding program where she could interact with gentle horses in a safe environment. Both girls continued therapy and made steady progress toward recovery, though their parents reported honestly that some scars would never fully heal. That was understandable. 4 years in a canyon would mark anyone forever, especially children. But the girls were alive. They were building futures. And they had a second chance that had seemed impossible. Years passed in the way years do. Thunder aged into a veteran ranch horse, his muzzle graying, his movements a bit slower. Jake eventually retired him from heavy work at age 12. The horse spent his remaining years in a private pasture near the house, living out his days in comfort and peace. No more hard rides. No more cattle work. Just grass and sunshine, and the occasional visit from children who came to meet the famous horse who had saved 2 girls. Jake never sold the ranch, never left the land that had become the setting for a miracle. He thought often about the randomness of fate and the importance of small decisions, about how Thunder's stubbornness had aligned perfectly with Lily and Emma's desperate need at exactly the right moment, about how one moment of paying attention had changed everything. Reporters occasionally called on the anniversary of the rescue, wanting to do follow-up stories. Jake always declined. The story belonged to Lily and Emma. They could share it or keep it private as they chose. Emma sent him a letter when she turned 16. She wrote about learning to ride horses seriously now, competing in shows, how working with horses had helped her overcome so many of her fears. She said every time she sat in the saddle she thought about Thunder refusing to leave that canyon edge, about how sometimes being stubborn and refusing to follow commands was exactly the right thing to be. The therapists called it healthy defiance, she wrote, the ability to resist pressure and trust yourself. Thunder had modeled that for her, showed her that saying no and standing your ground could save lives. She thanked Jake again for not leaving them, for keeping his promise, for showing her that good people still existed in a world that had tried to teach her otherwise. Jake kept the letter with Emma's drawing and all the photos the girls had sent over the years. Together they represented something important that he returned to whenever doubt crept in. A reminder that small actions mattered, that attention and instinct could save lives, that horses understood things humans sometimes missed, that miracles could happen in the most unexpected ways. Thunder died peacefully in his sleep on a warm summer night when he was 17 years old. Jake found him in the pasture the next morning, lying in the grass with wildflowers growing around him. He sat beside the horse's body for a long time, one hand on Thunder's still warm neck. He thought about all the years they'd worked together, all the miles they'd covered across the ranch, all the ordinary days when Thunder had been just a good working horse doing his job, and most importantly, about one particular day when Thunder had refused to be ordinary. When the horse had trusted his instincts and had saved 2 lives by being stubborn enough to disobey. Jake called Lily and Emma to tell them. Both young women cried on the phone. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, asked if she could come to the ranch to say goodbye. She wanted to pay her respects to the horse who had given her life back. Jake agreed immediately. She arrived 2 days later with her parents. She was tall now, healthy and strong, filled out to normal proportions. She looked like any other teenager. But when she approached Thunder's grave in the pasture, marked by a simple stone Jake had placed, she became the small, frightened girl Jake had first met in the canyon. She knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the stone. She stayed there for nearly an hour, while her parents and Jake waited at a respectful distance. They could see her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. When she finally stood, her face was streaked with tears but peaceful. She told Jake that Thunder had given her more than rescue. The horse had given her proof that the world still held goodness after she'd experienced the worst it had to offer. that not all creatures would hurt her. That trust was possible even after everything she had endured. The horse had shown her it was safe to hope again. Jake understood. Thunder had been more than a horse to these girls. He'd been a symbol of hope and salvation, and the possibility that terrible situations could end and healing could begin. Emma asked if she could have some of Thunder's mane. Jake had saved the tail and mane when preparing the body for burial, knowing this request might come. He gave Emma a small braid he'd made from Thunder's mane. She held it carefully, like it was precious beyond measure, and promised to keep it forever. Before leaving, Emma told Jake about her plans. She was going to study equine therapy in college. She wanted to help other traumatized children heal through interaction with horses. She'd experienced firsthand how horses could reach people in ways humans couldn't. She wanted to pass on the gift Thunder had given her, to help countless other children the way she'd been helped. Jake thought that was the most fitting tribute possible to Thunder's legacy. The horse hadn't just saved 2 girls. Through Emma's future work, Thunder would help heal hundreds or maybe thousands of trauma survivors over the years to come. Time continued its inexorable forward march. Jake eventually hired a ranch manager and stepped back from daily operations. He kept the property but spent more time traveling and less time working. He visited his sister in Montana and his old army buddy in Texas and places he'd always meant to see but had never found time for. The northern pasture where Thunder was buried became a place Jake visited often. He'd sit by the grave and remember. Sometimes he'd see the ghost of Thunder in his mind, standing at the canyon edge with his ears forward and his body tense, refusing to move. That image never faded. On the 10th anniversary of the rescue, Jake, Lily, and Emma met at the ranch. Lily was 23 now, working as a social worker specializing in recovered children. She'd turned her trauma into purpose, using her experience to help others navigate their own recoveries. Emma was 20, finishing her equine therapy degree. Both women were strong and capable and whole in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. They stood together at the edge of the hidden canyon, 3 survivors bound by a shared miracle. They looked down into the depths that had once held so much suffering. The canyon was unchanged, still concealed by the rock overhang, still invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, still a hole in the desert that could trap the unwary. Lily said she didn't hate this place anymore. It had tested her and Emma in ways no one should ever be tested. But they had survived. They had won. The canyon had tried to keep them forever, but had failed. Now it was just a geological formation, powerless, empty, unable to hurt anyone ever again. Emma added that she was grateful for the experience in a strange way that took years of therapy to reach. It had shaped who she became. It had taught her strength she didn't know she possessed. It had shown her the depth of her sister's love and protection. It had made her appreciate every single day of freedom and safety that most people took for granted. Jake listened to both women and felt a profound sense of completion. The girls had truly healed, not in the sense that the trauma was erased because that never happened, but in the sense that they had integrated it into their lives without letting it define them. They had become remarkable women, strong, compassionate, dedicated to helping others avoid or overcome similar trauma. Thunder's stubbornness on that day 10 years earlier had set in motion a chain of events that would help hundreds of people in the years to come through the work these women would do. As the sun set over the canyon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake felt Thunder's presence somehow. Maybe it was imagination, or wishful thinking, or the human tendency to find meaning in randomness. But he chose to believe the horse's spirit remained somehow, still watching over this place where everything had changed. The 3 stood together in comfortable silence until darkness fell. Stars began appearing overhead, the same stars that had looked down on 2 desperate girls fighting to survive year after year in that hole. Then they walked back to the ranch house together, leaving the canyon behind. It had given up its secrets. It had released its prisoners. And now it was just a scar on the landscape. A reminder of pain overcome and hope restored and the difference one stubborn horse had made. Jake knew the story would be told and retold for years to come. The rancher's horse that saved 2 girls. It would become legend, details shifting and exaggerating with each telling. But those who had lived it would always know the truth. A good horse noticed something wrong. A rancher trusted his animals' instincts instead of dismissing them. 2 girls who refused to give up were given a second chance at life. And from that intersection of chance and choice and stubborn determination, something beautiful had emerged. The world kept turning. Seasons changed. New challenges arose and were met, but the lesson remained constant and true. Pay attention to the small things. Trust your instincts. And never underestimate the difference one moment of awareness can make in someone's life. That lesson had been written in Jake's bones by thunder and by two girls who survived the impossible. He thought about it every day for the rest of his life, and whenever he saw a horse acting strangely or sensed something out of place in the world around him, he always stopped to investigate, because you never knew when that moment of attention might save a life. Thunder had taught him that, and it was a lesson worth remembering forever.